Good morning. Good afternoon. Good evening. Hello. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Jennifer Summers. I'm the Program Development Specialist with the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, and you here have come to our annual spring seminar series, which is titled The Landmark Environmental Policies, History, Impacts, and the Future. So first of all, I'd like to take a moment to say a couple of thank yous to people who helped bring this seminar series together. This is hosted by the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, but this is a collaboration between us and the whole College of Natural Resources. So this is the CNR Spring Seminar Series. So we'd like to thank everybody in the CNR who helped pull this together. I'd also like to thank Dr. Shelley Dubé, who is the acting interim director of the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife, for her assistance in bringing this together. And of course, our now retired past director, Dr. Scott Hingstrom, he just recently retired, but he played a critical role in helping us identify. Helped us to identify speakers and helped to bring this seminar series together. So, and Scott is an extension specialist, so this is part of UW extension projects and efforts. So thank you, everybody. So I'd like to please just take a note to save the dates. This is the first seminar in this series. There are a total of 6, and they're not exactly every week or every other week, so the schedule's a little wonky, but these are the next talks coming up. Next week, we have Chris Segal, who is an environmental attorney, and he is going to be coming, and he's going to talk about the Endangered Species Act. And he has written books on the topic. He is a national expert and somebody who's very, very knowledgeable about the topic, and it should be a very, very interesting talk. So all of the talks in this series are going to be featuring landmark environmental policies, as the title implies. So there is going to be one about the Endangered Species Act. Next is going to be the Clean Water Act, and then we'll have one about the Clean Air Act. And then there's a couple talks that are going to be focusing on how those policies impact natural resources professionals on the ground. So we are going to, how these policies affect actual practices. So all of you natural resources students, these are very relevant to you. And of course, these are relevant to anybody who has any interest in environmental preservation and protection. So, so thank you. Save those dates. We'd love to see you again in the future. And next, it is time to introduce our speaker today, who is going to be sorry, I should advance my slides before I talk. So this is an agreement that we have with the local tribes of this area. So we recognize that the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point occupies lands of the Ho-Chunk and Menominee people. Please take a moment to acknowledge and honor the ancestral Ho-Chunk and Menominee land and the sacred land of all indigenous peoples. Thank you. And with that, we'll introduce our speaker today.
Do I need to hold this?
Yes, you do.
Okay. I'm very, very honored and happy that Jim is here. Jim and I have known each other, since 2001. We worked together at Arizona Game and Fish Department. At that time, he was a game specialist out of Tucson, which seems like forever ago, does it not?
How many pictures you have of him.
Yeah, well, this is what happens when he actually texted this to me, probably not knowing I would use it against him. But
I missed that, Harry.
yeah, that's what it was about. That's what I was going to say. He sent me this picture describing his once glorious hair. And so I thought, well, I certainly need to include that in my introduction because things have changed a little bit since we were at HorrorCon, but he is a Wisconsinite. That was the real reason I wanted to put this picture in here, is that he grew up here, so he knows all about the Midwest and Midwest Nice and Point Beer and all sorts of things that are relevant to us here in Stevens Point. But since then, he's gone on to work with Mexican wolf recovery. There are about at least 242 Mexican wolves now in Arizona and Arizona and New Mexico, and that is partly because of the work that Jim has been doing as the science coordinator for the Arizona Game and Fish Department. So in 1998 there were 0, and now there are the management goal is 320. The other thing I remember about Jim is that he almost was bitten by a rattlesnake when he was hunting, and he told me today that it was the only time he ever said the F word in front of his dad, because his dad is 90 years old and still goes out and hunts and harvests critters every year that he goes out and hunts. It's amazing. It's the Heffelfingers take on the wildlife of Arizona, and the Heffelfingers win, it seems like, every year. So I didn't say really all of the things I had written down. I said a bunch of other stuff.
Thank goodness for that. Holy cow. All right, I probably need to advance this, right?
Yeah.
Get rid of that nonsense. There we go, good.
I was happy about that nonsense.
That's good. All right, this really brings back memories, because 40 years ago I was sitting in these chairs listening to lectures, boring ones like this one, about acts and stuff like that, and trying to memorize all these dates and facts and figures. But I was just pointing out this scar I have on my finger. I pinched it in one of these desks that you flip over, and I got it caught, and it gouged my finger, and I still have a scar right here from, I don't know, it was over here somewhere, probably. So it's really cool to be back in this room. Long history, for sure, with the university, and 32 years with the Arizona Game and Fish Department now. So today we're going to talk about a really important act that has just driven conservation since 1937, and even before that, as we'll talk about some of the ramping up of that. But first, let's talk about, maybe clear up some confusion. You hear about Pittman-Robertson, you hear about federal aid and that sort of thing. So this act of Pittman-Robertson Act was introduced by people named Pittman and Robertson. The act itself was really called Wildlife Restoration Act originally, and it was federal aid, so it was called the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act. So you might hear people talk about Pittman-Robertson, talk about PR funds, talk about federal aid and wildlife restoration. A lot of times you hear people talk about federal aid money in the conservation realm. That, as we'll see, that Pittman-Robertson Act was joined by some other acts and some other laws that kind of added and built on this foundation of conservation funding. And so now the term really is Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program. That's what it's called. And that's not just Pittman-Robertson. We'll talk about all the things that were added to that. But that's what we call right now the Fish and Wildlife Services Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program, or WSFR. The cool kids call it WSFR. So memorize that, and you'll sound like you're like in the in crowd. So let's as an overview, I'm going to talk about several things. I'm going to talk about how and why this federal aid and wildlife restoration, and how WSFR kind of came into effect, and why it did, why it was important. We'll talk about where the money comes from to come into this fund, and then we'll talk about the disbursement, or the Fish and Wildlife Service calls it the apportionment. That's just giving out portions of it to the state agencies, where it goes once it's in the fund. And then we'll follow up just by talking about conservation funding in the future, and this WSFR program, and whether that's really going to carry us on into the future with all the challenges that we have in conservation. So I'm not going to spend much time talking about the era of overexploitation. Everybody here hopefully has heard the sad tale of early in our history thinking wildlife was just unending, and we could do anything we want to and they'd always be here, and we found out very much that that's certainly not the fact. So early on, we had people recognizing the wildlife disappearing locally. And so in different states in the east, because settlement was going from the east to the west, in different states started to realize that wildlife was disappearing. So you started seeing some early game laws, really restrictions at that time. And even in the middle 1600s, we had some restrictions on deer hunting closure in Rhode Island. Think about how early that was in the nation's history. 1700s, we had Massachusetts hiring the first game wardens. They were deer wardens to kind of protect the deer population. And then by the 1800s, we had restrictions on white-tailed deer harvest in all the 13 original colonies. And so you start to see that kind of timeline of people realizing that wildlife's not endless, and we need to start doing something to limit the hemorrhaging, quite literally, the hemorrhaging of wildlife populations in the early part of our settlement. And then you started seeing state fish and wildlife agencies, and there's different every state has a different name. We've got Wisconsin DNR, we have Arizona Game and Fish, we have Mississippi Wildlife Fisheries and Parks, and it's confusing because they all have different names, but we can call them state wildlife and fish agencies because that's what they are. They're responsible for the management of the populations and the wildlife, no matter what the actual title is. But you started seeing the formation of those 1800s, early 1900s, the commissions starting to come together. You might have Arizona had a fish commission at first, and then they added wildlife, and it was a wildlife and fish commission. So every state did it differently, but they started developing these early commissions, and they would hire a state game warden normally, and you have one game warden for the whole state, and he didn't even have a truck. So it was really just kind of someone who was put in charge of kind of watching over the wildlife without really a force to do much with it. When you saw this development, you see this increase in interest of protecting wildlife and starting to get agencies in place that might have that responsibility. So then we get into the 1930s, and you see more and more momentum and interest in conserving wildlife and wildlife conservation, and people realizing something had to be done but not sure what to do. So in the 30s, we had the Duck Stamp Act that started conserving wetlands, millions and millions of dollars conserving wetlands. Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, which had to do with water quality and making sure the natural waterways weren't polluted in various ways. The co-op system developed. We've got a fisheries co-op system here. Madison has the wildlife co-op, which is kind of unusual. Most states have fish and wildlife co-op in the same unit, but those in the 1930s, those were developed, and they've grown a little bit. In fact, recently grown a little. But you see you're starting to get some infrastructure on getting federal agency at that time, well, still the Wildlife Management Institute and the state agencies and universities all working together and saying, what do we need to learn to conserve wildlife better? Let's do that kind of research to help us make management decisions. That was 1930s. The first North American conference, it's called, North American Wildlife and Natural Resource Conference in the 1930s. I'll be attending the 89th North American Conference in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 6 weeks or so, still continuing to this day, being a force for coordinating conservation. National Wildlife Federation was formed, Ducks Unlimited was formed. So you start seeing 1930s was really the time when all this stuff started happening. And a lot of that was sparked because of the American game policy that was written by Aldo Leopold and A. Willis Robertson. Remember that name, Robertson. That might be important a little bit later. But they started thinking about, we need to do something. What needs to be done to develop a system of conservation? And they came up with really three main things. They said, first of all, we need some kind of wildlife restoration program to help us restore wildlife. We also need some stable funding source that we know will carry us on into the future. And then we need scientifically trained people to implement that and to do it. So we've got people that are trained in this area actually using that stable funding source to implement this restoration program. And actually within 10 years, spoiler alert, within 10 years, all three of these things were in place. So it was really the 1930s that stuff really ramped up and got everybody talking and really thinking about things. And so the Pittman-Robertson Act was introduced by Key Pittman and A. Willis Robertson in 1937. And that act took an existing 11% excise tax on long guns and ammunition that was just going into the state treasury, or the federal treasury. It was just going to the government. It wasn't earmarked for anything. And that act then redirected that 11% tax on ammunition and long guns only, and earmarked it into a fund that would then be apportioned or distributed to state wildlife agencies to do good things. And we'll talk about the things that they're doing. Now that money is not just the federal government just like giving all the state agencies a bunch of money. The state agencies develop a plan and say, this is what we're going to do in the next year to conserve wildlife. This is what we promised to do for that money. Then at the end of the year, they write a report and they say, we said we were going to do this, and this is what we did. We did all of that stuff. And at that point then, it's a reimbursement from Fish and Wildlife Service to the state agencies. So the Fish and Wildlife Service then reimburses 75% of those costs. So in the end, the state agencies matching 25%. The Pittman-Robertson Act is contributing 75% to the things those state agencies did. And those funds are distributed to the states based on the size of the state, the land mass, and the number of hunting licenses for the Pittman-Robertson Act that they have. But one really, really important and actually brilliant part of the Pittman-Robertson Act was the fact that they required, before Fish and Wildlife Service would give states any money, they required the states to pass laws that said this money that they're getting can't be used for any other purpose. So the politicians can't rate it to help balance the budget. And so every state had to pass called assent laws, which means they can't use that for anything else. And I know personally an Arizona legislator one time wanted to get some of that money, and he was going to introduce a bill to get some of that Pittman-Robertson money and use it to balance the budget or something, and then found out pretty quickly that you can't do that. There's laws that say you can't do that. So the fact that they wrote that in the 1930s was absolutely brilliant. I think they knew how politicians act and wrote that into it. I don't know if anybody recognizes Pat Robertson. I grew up with Pat Robertson, the 700 Club, on the TV and saw him all the time. That's A. Willis Robertson's son that I didn't realize until recently. That's the son of the Pittman-Robertson. So interesting trivia. So then we have the Pittman-Robertson Act, and that was seen as for what it was, really a brilliant piece of legislation. It was really doing good things. So by the 1950s, 13 years later, 1950, they said, well, what about the fish side of it? And so we had a couple legislators, John Dingle and Edwin Johnson. And John Dingle's daughter is still a senator or a congresswoman somewhere, and very active in conservation. They put together kind of a matching piece of legislation for sport fish. And so that was passed. And so we had Pittman-Robertson that was related to wildlife, and then we had Dingle-Johnson, which is sport fish. So sometimes you see DJ for Dingle-Johnson, you see DJ and PR funds. And then 1970s, they expanded the Pittman-Robertson part of it to include a 10% tax on pistols. And so that was added to it. And so this is where we start, this additional legislation starts getting added to the foundation, Pittman-Robertson Act and Dingle-Johnson Act, and things start getting added to it, and we start building this, what we call now the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program, because it's not just Pittman-Robertson, it's a whole bunch of things together. And so 1972, there was 11% excise tax on archery equipment, because people started archery hunting at that time. That was starting to get popular. And then in 1984, added the Wallet Bureau, which was that was an addition, kind of an addendum to the Dingle-Johnson Act, the fisheries part of it. And so that Wallet Bureau then put a tax on boats, put a tax on boating fuel, and that turns out to be pretty significant amount of income coming into that program. And then in 2000, there was a Federal Aid and Improvement Act, and that had additional money for Hunter Ed, and then it also establishes multi-grant program where several state agencies can get together and write a grant for funds for something that benefits all of those state agencies collectively, trying to get state agencies to work together into big blocks more, and that has been really important to do some good things. So we look overall at the income coming into the federal aid portion of it, or the Pittman-Robertson portion of it. You have about a third pistols, and about a third other firearms, and about a third ammunition, and a little bit of archery. So that's where that money is primarily coming from for the Pittman-Robertson part of it. On the Dingle-Johnson, which includes that Wallet Bureau and the boat tax, you can see how significant the tax on boating fuel is to funding that sport fish restoration program. So it expanded a little more fishing tackle, fishing equipment, and then also that fuel is such a big part. That picture was taken less than 24 hours ago, and I'm kind of proud of those crappies. So as I said, this stuff's apportioned out. The wildlife part of it, the Pittman-Robertson part of it, 50%, the formula is 50% of that money gets apportioned out as a percentage of land base. So each state, what land base they have in the proportion of the whole. And then also the other half of the formula then is the number of hunting license holders. And then the sport fish program is really basically the same. A little less of it's based on land mass, which probably makes sense if you're talking about fisheries. You probably don't want to base it on land mass. So it's 40% of the land area and 60% of fishing license holders. And then that minimum maximum thing is that the formula is set up so no state will get less than 1%. And that's to kind of even it out a little when you've got some of these small states, and then you have like Texas with a whole bunch of land and a whole bunch of license holders. And the maximum is 5%, so it kind of evens that out a little bit. So the trends in the apportionment of money going out to the state agencies has been upward. I mean, you can see that it's about $800 million for a while, and now it's shot up to $1.2 billion in the last couple of years. In the last couple of years, that increase is really not archery. You can see that green hasn't changed very much, but increases in firearms, increases in pistols specifically, increases in ammunition, and that's driven this fund of money for conservation upward in the last couple of years. And you think, well, what's happened the last couple of years? We've had a lot of social unrest, we've had the pandemic, and we've had a huge increase in the number of firearms purchased. Americans bought 60 million firearms during the pandemic, and 14 million Americans bought a new gun, which, guilty. I probably bought more than one in the last couple of years. But what I think is really fascinating is 7.5 million people bought a firearm for the first time. So it's not just like gun nuts buying more guns. I mean, there's people that didn't own a gun. 7.5 million of them now own a gun that they didn't before. So there's an increase in the interest of having a firearm for self-defense and target shooting. The activity of target shooting, firearms training has gone way up in popularity, a lot more of that. This has been popular. And then when you're out there, the 52% of the target shooters haven't hunted. So it's not like all these hunters that are contributing to sport, fish, and wildlife restoration are going out target shooting too. There's a huge segment of society that are target shooting, interested in shooting firearms, that don't have any interest in hunting. And I shoot, those are my arms there. And I've shot pistol competitions for 30 years. And when I'm on the range and talking to people, it seems to me like almost nobody hunts. There's just a few people that hunt. They're all pistol competitors, and a few of them will start talking about hunting if they know who I am. So I know I have the right to bear arms, but I'd rather cover them so I don't get sunburned. I have 4 sons, so I'm pretty good at the dad jokes. But what's really interesting, the non-hunting uses of firearms makes up 70% of the Pittman-Robertson funds. So sportsmen are paying for wildlife conservation, but target shooters are paying more than hunters are in wildlife conservation. And a lot of that is just the last couple of years with that big increase. But target shooters are paying a lot more for the whole wildlife and sport fish restoration programs, specifically the PR side of it. So if you look at wildlife restoration and sport fish restoration, the first 2 columns are 2022 and 23, and you can see the increase. So it's a pretty strong 7.5% increase. You add the state, the 25% matching from the state, and you end up with $1.6 billion per year being sent to state wildlife agencies to do wildlife stuff. And on the fisheries side, $500 million a year going to state wildlife agencies. So you can see this is a significant funding driver for state wildlife agencies, even though they have some other sources of income. And this isn't even updated. Now we've blown through the top of the chart at $1.2 billion. But the red is Pittman-Robertson, and then the purple is Dingell-Johnson, and then the blue line is the state wildlife grants that came online in 2000 and provide some more funding for state agencies. And so where does it go? That's where all the money came from. Where does all that money go then once the Fish and Wildlife Service has it in a big pot and they're going to distribute it out to the state agencies? Now, first of all, the WSFR program, there's a whole bunch of different programs that people don't talk about as much. We're just talking about Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson, the first 2 there, but there's a whole bunch of other grant programs that are available for conservation. So it's a much bigger system than what we're talking about. Definitely the 2 big portions of that are Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson. But just be aware there's a whole bunch of other things going on that's funding conservation. So look at the Pittman-Robertson Act specifically and the kind of things it does. When state agencies get that money, they use it for restoration, conservation, management of actual wildlife populations, doing surveys, doing translocations, and for birds and mammals. Also providing public use, and that's like just providing not only access, but providing opportunities for people to enjoy wildlife. And that's not just hunting, that's also wildlife watching too. Acquiring and managing habitats. We have wildlife management areas that state agencies have throughout the whole country and manage those wildlife agencies. Also educating hunters, so it's hunter education, all of those funds going into hunter education. constructing and operating shooting ranges, since a lot of that money is coming from target shooters, both archery and firearms. Then that Pittman-Robertson money is used a lot more and more, actually, because of the increases to fund that those kind of activities, build shooting ranges. What it's not legal for is law enforcement. We can't fund game wardens, can't fund law enforcement, can't fund wildlife rehabilitators, and an agency can't use the money just to promote themselves, just to advertise the agency and the good things that they do. And the animals that are eligible, any bird or mammal is eligible, regardless of whether it's hunted or not, for this kind of funds to use for conservation. So there's over 500 species of birds and mammals that are actually actively managed under the PR grant program, and just about 115 of those are hunted. So agencies can use this for a broader conservation mission, and it's not just used for deer and elk and turkeys and those species. So over 500 bird and mammal species, 48 million acres that are operated and maintained in wildlife areas, more than 70 sport fish species, and 800 shooting ranges just in the past 3 years. So a lot of activity in not only the target shooting side, but wildlife and fish conservation side. And one of the things that the sport fish program, the wildlife and sport fish program does, is provide information to the people about this program and the things that the state agencies are doing to kind of benefit these species. And so they put out a lot of information. The one on the left is specific to New York and wild turkey restoration. In that case, they talk not only about the dollars that come in to restore turkeys, but also how that money and how hunters contribute to the economy in New York. And they use economic multipliers to show the actual effect of hunters and their activity and staying in motels and buying gas and staying in or visiting restaurants, and how they contribute to the economy of New York. And then also, see the 36 million here, that's 36 million meals provided by the turkeys that have been harvested. So they look at the number of turkeys harvested, about how many meals from that poundage of turkey meat. And so one of the things that the program does is to get kind of information out there and get people thinking about the benefit of this program and the good things that are being done out there. Oh, I'm sorry, the other one was wildlife health. I mean, we have a whole bunch of federal aid money that's going to disease monitoring, disease management, both on the fish side, which is the Dingell-Johnson side on the right, and then Pittman-Robertson on the wildlife side. So disease management is something that we're all more aware of and more concerned about in recent years. Also, target range development, and then that multi-state conservation grant program, which has been good. A lot of that money has been used, some of that money has been used for surveys, to survey the public human dimensions work, to see more how the public feels about issues so that agencies can use that information and manage the public's resource as the public would like to see it managed. But that's not all. It's a lot of on-the-ground conservation work has been done with that too. So look specifically at some of these activities that are funded by the Pittman-Robertson Act and also the Dingell-Johnson Act. There's been over 1 million students that have been educated in not just hunter education, but hunting and fishing, aquatic resources. Some states have trapping education classes and some other tangential classes like that. And talking specifically just about hunter education, about just the hunting side of it, 2 million students in the last 3 years. And the good thing about hunter education classes is the fact that they're very strong on firearm safety. And I had, when one of my sons went through hunter education, his friend's mother said that she wanted her son to go through hunter education with my son. They had no interest in hunting, but she wanted him to get this basic firearms safety information about the rules of good gun safety, and it incorporates some of the NRA's work that talks about teaching kids, if you see a gun, stop, don't touch it, go get an adult. Things like that kids have to be taught to be safer out there. And so all this hunter education is not necessarily just for hunters, but I think it's doing a good job of keeping kids a lot safer. Access is a huge thing. When you do a survey and you ask hunters why they quit hunting, or why they're interested in hunting but they're not hunting, access is a big deal. Finding a place to go is a big issue. And so a lot of the money is spent providing access. So tens of millions of acres of access to wildlife management areas, hundreds of thousands of acres acquired that weren't public land before, but now are acquired for use. And then it's interesting when you survey the people using those wildlife areas, only about 70% of them are actually not hunting at the time. So it's why we sometimes talk about a user benefit, or a user pay, everyone benefits model. Because there's a subset of the population that's paying, and then everybody benefits. They can go hiking, they can go bird watching, they can do anything on these lands that are paid for with $100 and target shooter dollars. Also on the fishing side, 1,600 access sites for boating, 1.2 billion fish stocked every year on an annual basis, 350 hatcheries. All of that stuff funded for public benefit to provide some aquatic resources. Research is a big part of that. State agencies, if they have a research branch like Arizona Game and Fish has, we get a big part of that federal aid money has an R after it for research. It's funded for research. And so we'll tell the Fish and Wildlife Service, here's the research projects we're going to work on this year. We work on those, and then at the end of the year, we do a report. I spent more than 2 decades writing federal aid reports saying this is what I did this year, because I had a federal aid funded position. And this is what I did this year to satisfy what we said we were going to do. And then, that reimbursement comes. So lots of research projects, $57 million annually to fund more than 10,000 research projects. That's huge. That's absolutely huge to learn more. And it's not all game species, it's all kinds of species, whatever an agency needs to learn more about. So when you just look kind of as an overview of where states spend a lot of their money, there's got to be some money spent on capital development. So we need kiosks sometimes, we need new bathrooms in some areas, we might need a visitor center. Picnic tables, those kind of things, depending on what kind of wildlife area it is. There's some coordination administration. We talked about hunter education. There's obviously some operations and maintenance. You can't let all that stuff just fall apart. And then a big chunk of research are the big chunks of that from the wildlife side. So that's the Pittman-Robertson. From Dingle Johnson's side of it, a lot of stocking, habitat improvement and development. Of course, some administration, operations and maintenance, but a big chunk of research too, to research the fisheries side of it. And the program, the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Program, has they've improved their web presence, and they've got a website where you can go and query. There's a dashboard. You can query a lot of this information. You can find out what each state got for their apportionment, and a lot of this information because the information flow is important. And that website's partnered with a payer. And that refers to the fact that the Fish and Wildlife Service is partnering with the payers, which in this case is industry, firearms and ammo manufacturers, fishing tackle manufacturers. So it's Fish and Wildlife Service partnering with those sources of that 10 or 11% excise tax. And so you can go there and you can find out a lot of this information. If you're looking to do some kind of economic analysis, how much money is being apportioned to the state and how it's being used. And then every 5 years, this same program, the WSFR program, every 5 years it puts out a survey on wildlife fishing and hunting, wildlife watching related recreation. And the new one just came out, and you can look through there, and it's broken down by all kinds of things. It's broken down by human demographic divisions. It's broken down. You can get the information broken down by state, broken down by big game hunters and small game hunters and anglers and all of that. So a big part of what they do is providing information about the program. So let's talk about overall the system of conservation funding. Almost zero tax dollars in state wildlife agencies. State wildlife agencies get almost zero tax dollars. And I say almost zero because there's a few states that have developed, like Missouri about 30 years ago, passed a legislation that gave that state agency 1/8 of 1% of the sales tax to go to the state wildlife agency for wildlife conservation. And most of that's earmarked for things that weren't already covered by Pittman-Robertson, by the federal aid and wildlife restoration. So it allowed them to do more work with habitat and more work with non-game, something we're going to have to do in the future a lot more. But most states are not getting any tax dollars. So when people say, hey, you guys are wasting my tax money, None, no tax money. And so agencies get their license and permit fees. That sometimes is about a third of an agency's budget. They sell hunting licenses, they sell fishing licenses, they sell tags and stamps. Obviously, all that money goes into the agency, and that's used for conservation as part of their budget. Pittman-Robertson, Dingell-Johnson, the Wallet-Burrough was the boat tax. That was part of the Dingell-Johnson. The State Wildlife Grant Program that came on in 2000. And then NGO partners, which we forget about a lot because they're not part of the government, either state or federal funding engine, but some of these organizations are spending tons of money and have a lot of volunteers. I mean, you look at hundreds of thousands of members across those organizations. You look at $3.5 billion in conservation expenditure since the 1930s when Ducks Unlimited came on board. Hundreds of millions of dollars in other ones, millions of acres of habitat conserved. And when you conserve habitat for ducks using duck hunter money, you've conserved wetland habitat for everything that uses those wetlands. You conserve grasslands for quail. You conserve forests for deer. You're not just conserving that habitat for those. Those millions of acres are not just benefiting deer and elk and ducks. And so that's when we say that this program, even though the money may be coming from single species, game species organizations, it's being used for things that benefit all species. We talk about rising tide floats all boats, and it's kind of like if we're doing habitat work, we're doing good conservation stuff, we're benefiting an awful lot of species. So when we talk about some of the recent changes in conservation funding and then also looking towards the future, what are we going to do in the future? The Pittman-Robertson Act really going to carry us into the future with a lot of the challenges that we face. And sometimes it's daunting. It's like, we've got, with climate change and with this habitat destruction and human population expansion, what are we going to do in the future? I mean, it just seems like almost insurmountable odds. And I always think back to the 1930s, and some smart people got together and they just figured it out. They just thought, okay, listen, we've got to do something. What can we do? And they figured out some really innovative, really ingenious ways to fund conservation funding. And going in the future, it's going to be up to us to get together, put our heads together, think about some innovative ways that we can fund conservation in a much broader, more inclusive way. And this picture comes from the Wildlife Society meeting last November in Louisville, Kentucky. And I organized a half-day symposium with 8 talks on state wildlife agencies and the things that they do that have nothing to do with hunting and fishing. Western pollinator conservation, with all the Western agencies working together on pollinator conservation. The state of Washington is leading wolf recovery, and the federal government has nothing to do with it. They're not endangered, they're just state-led wolf recovery. We got collaborations among agencies. So we had 8 talks talking about some really cool things that agencies are doing that don't have anything to do with the hook and bullet crowd. And so we need to, and then there was also another symposium too on the North American model and the future of the North American model and what we're going to do and what the North American model lacks and what we're going to do in the future for funding. So you all have to be involved in that conversation. You all have to be at the table and helping to be those smart people that drive us into the future, and we're not going to be able to continue with the way we have been. We need to think big, think more collaboratively about funding conservation and doing things on a bigger scale, be more inclusive and work together. There's an awful lot of people that care about wildlife and they're not always at the table. And even if we don't agree with them, we need to find where we do agree, and there are certainly some things we care about in the future of wildlife and fish and the places they live. Come together and work with them on the things that we can agree on and understand that we may not agree about some things, but we got to work together on what we can agree on. And wildlife belongs to everyone. So I think, frankly, a big segment of the population, it's time to get out of the wagon and start pulling and helping. So I think everybody needs to be involved in the future of wildlife conservation funding. And that doesn't mean we're going to neglect the species we spend money on. The early Pittman-Robertson Act and the early research in the 1930s that started, we didn't start researching warblers because we didn't need to. We had these large mammals that were full of meat and wrapped in leather, really useful things to early settlers. And those were the animals that were being overexploited because they were useful for those reasons. And so it just makes sense that that money had to go to those animals that were useful for some reason and being overexploited and save them. And now our conservation system has evolved, luckily to the point where we're doing a ton of really good things for all of the other species. But that doesn't mean that in the future we're not going to spend money on deer surveys and things like that, because we need to. The public is interested in using those resources, so we need to monitor those more closely than we might need to monitor scarlet tanagers or something. So in that conversation we had at the TWS meeting about the North American model and the future of the North American model and whether that's going to carry us on into the future, you'll find in the peer-reviewed literature, you'll find some peer-reviewed papers that criticize the North American model as not inclusive and it's lacking this and it's lacking that. The North American model was never intended to be a strategic plan. Nobody sat down and wrote it out and said, okay, this is our recipe book. This is how we conserve wildlife. The North American model was written down by Valerius Geist when someone challenged him, when he was concerned about captive cervids. And then he was telling those people, you have such a great system, a model of conservation in North America. And the person said, what are you talking about, system? We don't have a system. And he said, sure you do. And he wrote a paper describing the North American model of wildlife conservation, how we conserve wildlife. And so at the time, he didn't intend it to be, here's a prescriptive plan and everybody has to follow it. And you have to be within the bounds of the model. He was just describing what was successful so far to this point in North America, and having us conserve almost all of our native species are still conserved, and we're still bringing some of them back. But he wrote a description of really what was being done. It was the Lacey Act, it was Pittman-Robertson, it was all these things that together made up a really successful system of conservation. And so people that criticize the model as like not including everything, like for example, it didn't include indigenous people in that model. It didn't include how it was going to be funded. It was never meant to be this all-encompassing plan, and so it's not surprising that it's missing pieces. But we need to use that North American model that's been so successful as the foundation for what we build on. It's been successful. We're not going to throw it out and try to come up with a new model. We're going to build on that foundation and build something bigger, build something more inclusive, and build something better. And so there's been some attempts to expand outside of just kind of this WSFR model where 4 or 5% of American people hunt. So 4 or 5%, that doesn't include the anglers and target shooters, but 4 or 5% hunt and are contributing into the system and trying to conserve all wildlife, which we can't. We need more money, we need more people involved. So back in the 90s, there was this thing called Teaming with Wildlife. And it was modeled after the Pittman-Robertson Dingell-Johnson Act. It was supposed to be for these other species that was not already covered by Pittman-Robertson. It was really opposed by the outdoor industry. It was like a tax on backpacks and field guides and binoculars and things like that to expand this kind of Pittman-Robertson model. And it was really opposed by the outdoor industry about getting more and more tax. Sometimes you'll hear it called the backpack tax just because it sounds kind of cool, but that's what it was. It was taxing more things. It had little support in Congress and failed. Then there was CARA, the Conservation and Reinvestment Act, and that was similar to the Teaming with Wildlife, but not funded with a tax, but funded with offshore royalties. That didn't pass. That didn't make it through. It just kind of died. But the next year, some legislators took some parts of that and built it into the appropriations bill for the next year, and that passed, which provided that's what developed that state wildlife grant system. And the state wildlife grants program, one thing it did is it forced states to develop state wildlife grant plans, state wildlife plans are called SWAPs. State wildlife action plans are called. And in there, they had to identify species of greatest conservation need. And so every state did that, and every state completed that plan. And that really kind of led, once we had that all identified, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is all 50 state wildlife agencies, and then also all Canadian province and territory wildlife agencies, they got together and put together a blue ribbon panel to look at conservation funding in the future. And part of their report said we need to have reliable, adequate funding for a bigger, more comprehensive system of conservation. Kind of obvious, but we had a think tank of kind of the leading conservationists come together and provide sort of a blueprint of what's needed. Conservation needs to be relevant to everybody. Everybody needs to feel like they're part of the conservation system. And then that really sparked and led to another piece of legislation that was introduced, unfortunately not passed, and that was RAWA. Hopefully you might have heard of RAWA, which is still in the mix, Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Almost passed in 2022. Everybody thought it was going to pass, and then at the last minute it didn't. It was reintroduced in 2023, and it's still in play. And if that was passed, that would provide another $1.4 billion in addition to the $1.2 billion from the WSFR program, and that money would be earmarked for those species that weren't already covered. It would be earmarked really for the species of greatest conservation needs that the state agencies have identified. So there's a couple ways we could go in the future, and I don't have any answers. I just have some information for you to all to think about and be involved and be part of the future conversation. You can stick with this user-focused model where there's a tax or the users are providing that income. Stay with shooters, hunters, and anglers. Or you can identify some other users and some user-specific funding sources. You could expand the number of things that are taxed. And this is all in the same kind of category of user-based income. You could expand that user base outside to more outdoor users, hikers, or what have you. The other way to go about it is kind of an appropriations-focused model. We have state sales taxes like Missouri. That's one way to go. And recovering the RAWA is also an appropriations model where the government's appropriating money to do this stuff. Now, the downside of that might be you've got politicians in Washington, D.C. that are deciding whether they're going to appropriate that money this year or not. If you don't have it protected, you've got Washington, D.C. deciding whether that program lives or dies, and you've got different administrations coming and going. And so there's some jeopardy there with that appropriations model. It's not just like the government needs to give us a bunch more money. It's a little more complex than that. So last slide. As I said before, within 10 years of the 1930 American wildlife policy, American game policy, we had a restoration program with the Pittman-Robertson Act. We had stable funding source that was protected. Nobody could rate it. Stable and secure funding source. And Aldo Leopold was the first university professor to start a wildlife program. So we had wildlife programs that started to crop up in some of these universities to start in the 1930s training some of these professionals that would go on and implement wildlife conservation in North America. So the WSFR generated $22.5 billion since its inception in 1937. Done amazing things. I mean, think about so many other countries. There's a whole bunch of native wildlife they lost and they're not getting back. And really, the United States and North America has done a fantastic job of conserving the complement of native predators and ungulates. We're still recovering some of the predators, but we've done a great job of conserving the native wildlife that we originally had. Really an amazing job, and that comes from really this WSFR program and everything that it included. But we're going to need a much more comprehensive system of secure funding, and you are all going to be part of figuring that out, figuring out where we're going from here. But we need to do a better job of being more inclusive and including much more of the species. And so I'll leave you with two things. One, thanks to some of the people that I know that deal in this all the time and getting me some of the information I needed. Also, a little flashback from my college days, which is not the first picture tonight that you've seen. Flashback from there, right? I was probably a sophomore in that picture that was Monty, the ball python. And then, and that was right down the street. Scott and I passed it on the way into town, our old apartment. And when we graduated, we got all of our returnable cases and took them in and bought a quarter barrel for our graduation party. But we had a one-room apartment, so we used point cases to make a wall and made a two-bedroom apartment. The microwave was inset in there. Yeah. So we have 10 minutes before we get kicked out. Any questions?
Does anyone have any questions?
Yep, go ahead.
Have you had any input with the Wisconsin DNR regarding wolf?
No, I know Adrian Weideman really well, who was the wolf biologist forever, and he's with the Western Timberwolf Alliance, I think. So I know Adrian really well. He'll send me things to keep me updated, but I'm up to my eyeballs in Mexican wolf recovery. That's like about half of what I do. It's a big part of my job. I don't have time to keep track of what Wisconsin's doing, so I'm not really involved, but I get snippets of information from Adrian just because I'm interested in what's going on. I know about the history of the hunt and the big fiasco that happened and all of that.
I thought it was really informative that you mentioned that state agencies don't get tax dollars. Then earlier you said that they match PR dollars, 25%. So where does the 25%?
Yeah, good question. That almost entirely comes from the licenses and permits that they sell. They sell fishing licenses, hunting licenses, deer tags, and that money is called the state fund, I think it's called. But that money's coming, they just generated that from selling licenses, so they use that for the 25% match. And what's important is that state agencies don't get enough of that money. They might not have enough to match what's available in the federal aid program. So sometimes the federal aid says, we've got this much money for you, but you need to match your 25%. And there's been times where state agencies are struggling to get all of the federal aid money they could, and that's a bad thing. If you're leaving money on the table because you're not making enough, and that's where you get like license and fee increases and things, because they just have to have enough to get all of their federal aid apportionment. It'd be terrible not to get all of what you could get, especially when it's a 3-to-1 match.
Before you answer the next question, I just want to say for our YouTube audience, can you please repeat the question?
Oh, absolutely, right. Yeah, rookie move, sorry.
So I am a member of the Wisconsin Conservation Congress, which is a unique body in Wisconsin, citizens that are elected in all 72 counties.
Yep.
And I'm the chair of the Outdoor Heritage and Education Committee. We get our Pittman-Robertson reports from DNR people and what they're doing. A lot of states are working to get more shooting ranges because the shooters are the ones that are putting a lot of money in. How successful are states across the country in getting those shooting ranges to keep
doing more for that? Yeah, so the question was, how successful are state wildlife agencies in using that Pittman-Robertson money to increase the number of shooting ranges and increase opportunities for shooters? And from what I see, I'm in the competitive shooting world, so I hear a lot about that. There's, like you saw, 800 new ranges throughout the country that have, in the last 3 years, that have been built. I know in Arizona, because I shoot at several ranges, and I see continual improvements. I mean, there's new stat tracks or buildings being built. The berms are being up higher, shades over the top, like cameras at each one of the bays. You see more and more money being put into existing ranges, and you see a whole bunch of new ranges going up. So sometimes people in the shooting industry will say, "Oh, we're paying more than the hunters are paying, so you should be spending more money." And I can tell you, agencies are spending a lot more, from what I see.
Are you seeing conflicts between those ranges and wildlife?
No. Are we seeing conflicts between those ranges and wildlife? The shooting ranges are such a small footprint. It's really not that big of a deal. In Arizona, we have wild burros around near the range that's by our headquarters. And if a burro shows up on the hill, it's like ceasefire, everybody stops, and everybody waits until the burros walk off there. So there really isn't that much of a conflict with wildlife and shooting ranges. There's a lot of conflict with shooting ranges and new residents that just put $1 million house 300 yards from the shooting range. I mean, come on. Yeah. And then they're wondering about the noise. Okay, there's got to be more than that.
I have a question.
No, you'll wait. Go ahead.
I deserve that.
Because I know you just have filler questions.
I don't.
Jason has
legitimate question.
Jason has a real one.
Riddle over me? No. We got something to talk about.
I can wait.
He bought me beer at the North America meeting.
So the North Central section sponsored this workshop at the Midwest a couple of days ago on co-stewardship of between tribal nations and federal agencies. And one conversation that came out of that was that the tribal nations don't seem to get an appropriation of PR dollars on their tribal lands, even though the members of those nations pay pay excise taxes on firearms
Right.
and
Yep.
ammunition as well.
Yep.
And I was wondering kind of what your take was on that,
Sure.
and the tribal
Yeah.
wildlife grants that are available, or, you know, even
Yeah.
anything close to what they might get a portion. if they
Yeah,
were-
so the question was, all the members of the tribal nations, they buy hunting and fishing and shooting equipment, so they're paying into the Pittman-Robertson Act, and yet the tribal nations that they may live on, or at least maybe they hunt on, are not getting the Pittman-Robertson proportion. And in the WISFR program, there's one of the grants, when I had all those grants, one grant that's tribal, and I don't know a lot about that, but there is a part of that deals with tribal funding. But then RAWA also has a big section, a big portion of that, if that gets funded, where a bunch of that money is going for tribal nations. And tribal nations, my experience is only in Arizona. It's a whole mix of whether they have a good established natural resource program on that tribal land or not. We've got some that have decades old, really well run by professionals, hunting and fishing programs, and then they do a whole bunch with endangered species. And there's some other tribal nations in Arizona that they really don't have anything developed. So that makes it a little difficult too, is the big diversity in how well they have an infrastructure to do something good with that. But that doesn't matter. It starts with getting funding, and I know RAWA has a big chunk of that, and I know, but I don't unfortunately know a lot of the details about it. The WISFR program also has a tribal section, and I kind of don't know what they do. But it's a good point. And when you go to the North American and you go to TWS, the national meetings, and I go to the AFWA meeting, which is all 50 states and Canadian provinces, wildlife agencies, there's a lot of discussions about that. It's not like it's being ignored. People are talking about, and that's when I talk about the North American model was not all inclusive, is missing some things, and the tribal piece is part of that's missing, that everybody's talking about how do we fix that.
Time for one more, then we're going to move.
Yeah, from Shelley.
No, it can be somebody else. I can.
Oh, you have the same question?
I know in Arizona you have a pretty good tax check-off fund for non-game stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How well does that work in leveraging Pittman-Robertson funds? And you would get quite a bit out of that for non-game projects.
Yeah, so the question was, states like Arizona has a checkoff where you can have part of your tax return go to this non-game fund. That has not been very popular. In a lot of states, it's not very popular. It comes up, it seems like a great idea, and initially there's a lot of advertisement about it, and some people do it, and then it falls off pretty quickly. It's just, I don't know why, it seems like a good idea, but just in reality, it doesn't fund a whole lot. And whether that money would be used to match Pittman-Robertson, I kind of don't think so, because it's earmarked for non-game stuff. Now you could match it and do, with Pittman-Robertson money, do pollinator work probably, but now we're getting kind of outside the sphere of what I know a whole lot about. So I'm not sure, but I do know that across the country, those non-game checkoffs, they haven't been a great mechanism for funding non-game work.
We'll have to move it along.
Okay, thanks.